Introduction. Could I start by thanking all involved in putting this important event together? Could I also thank each of you for being here tonight to discuss this critical topic? As the Dean of a Catholic law school in a Catholic university, the University of Notre, Australia, I simply could not do what I do every day without religious freedom. So it is an existential issue for the School of Law in Sydney and for the University of Notre, Australia. This evening, as Mark just indicated, I'll address the question what our lawmakers need to do to better protect religious freedom. Before I turn to that specific topic, I wanted to first discuss some important facts that should guide our lawmakers in this area. The first is that religious freedom is part of our inherent dignity, and it is not something that the state confers. Why do I say that? Well, as far as we can tell from the artefacts they left behind, from the very beginning of humanity, human beings have looked for meaning and for purpose in their lives, and they've found that meaning and purpose in religious faith. This need, this longing within us, predates the state. It is a right, as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights puts it, which is derived from the inherent dignity of the human person. This right to pursue meaning in our lives, the right to religious freedom, is therefore not properly thought of as a right that a state gives its citizens by its laws, or something that a state has any right to take away. It is a pre-existing right, and part and parcel of what it means to be a human being. Matthew 22 verses 37 to 38 records Jesus' answer to the question, which is the greatest commandment of them all? And he said this, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Those words, with all your mind, are very significant, aren't they? They mean that we are asked to think about God, and to think very deeply, with all our mind. Now, how can we do that if we cannot learn about God and if we don't enjoy religious freedom? Now, I'm very comfortable with the Christian tradition within which I worship, and that it's true, but I could be wrong. It's important to hear other perspectives about religion, so that we might, as St. Paul puts it in 1 Thessalonians 5:21 to 22, test everything and hold on to what is good. So the right to religious freedom predates the state. It's not granted by the state, and it's part of our inherent dignity as human beings. But what is it exactly? Is it all in the mind? Is this right to religious freedom inherent in every human being limited to the internal exercise of belief within our minds? Well, no, it's not. As far as we can tell, people who live within a particular religious tradition have always behaved differently to others. The reason we know about the longevity of religious belief in human history is that human beings have always acted on their religious faith. They have acted on their faith. They've done things. They've created art. They've created places of worship. They've buried their dead in particular religious ways. This is a fundamental feature of religion. Religion demands things from its followers. They impose duties. They have their own doctrines and moral codes of behaviour which their believers follow. As the High Court of Australia put it in the New Church of the New Faith case, there are two criteria for religion to be recognised as a religion in Australia. First, belief in a supernatural being, thing or principle, and second, the acceptance of canons of conduct in order to give effect to that belief. Religious people are, in other words, called on to think, but also to behave differently to other people. This is the core of religion, and at the heart of being a person of religious faith. Just consider the early Christians. Why did they stand out? They did not behave as the Romans did. They did not worship the Roman gods. They got married. They had families. They did not practice infanticide, contraception or abortion, or the sexual behaviours common in the empire. And they cared for the sick and the poor. Now we can see examples in Australian history where Australians have shown their respect for religious freedom And they've done so because it's the right thing to do, not because of any compulsion of law. So let's think of a couple of examples of that. The National Rugby League team, Canterbury Bankstown, agreed to an employment contract with star player Will Hopewate, which enabled him to not play rugby league on Sundays to accommodate his faith. Will has now decided that he will play on a Sunday, but that's his choice to make. The Australian Cricket Board and Big Bash League teams have agreed that Usman Khawaja and Farid Ahmed, who are both cricketers of the Islamic faith, need not wear advertisements for alcohol on their jerseys. And perhaps most importantly of all, the freedom of conscience that our politicians, when dealing with issues such as abortion and euthanasia, are granted in Australia's two largest political parties, the Australian Labor Party and the Liberal Party. Theoretically, at least in the Liberal Party, this extends to all issues. Now those examples shouldn't come as a surprise, as the right to religious belief and to manifest that belief through action predates the state and is an inherent part of human dignity, which is not granted by the state. This is how you would expect people to behave, to accommodate the religious beliefs of others, particularly in a pluralist and multi-faith nation like Australia. But these simple acts of dignity, of decency, are notable because they stand in stark contrast to the sorts of failures of basic decency that John's been talking about, and respect for religious freedom, which we're becoming more and more familiar with. Our society and our politicians seem to have forgotten how fundamental religious freedom is to human dignity, to being a human person. The next fact I wanted to note is that religious belief and the manifestation of religious belief through action are good for people, and religious freedom is good for states. I can't go into all of the empirical evidence for these facts now, but it's undeniable, and there's ample empirical evidence for both those facts. In Australia, Syros, and around the world, Notre adjunct Dr. Brian Grimm have demonstrated the economic value to states of religious belief and of religious freedom. Our society and our politicians seem to have forgotten or to be afraid to recognise the simple statistical fact that religion is good for people and religious freedom is good for society. Now, I think that background is important because, in my view to date, the law in Australia has done more to damage than to respect or protect religious freedom. This is firstly because, although Australia has entered into a number of international obligations to protect religious freedom, like the ICCPR that I mentioned earlier, it has not so far adopted any national law to protect religious freedom or to prevent religious discrimination. This might not be such an issue, were it not for the fact that it has passed national anti-discrimination laws which protect and privilege certain other attributes and behaviours, such as race, disability, age, sex and sexual orientation. Now, in passing all of these anti-discrimination laws, the Commonwealth recognised that they would create conflicts for mainstream religions. To cater for those, the law provided certain exemptions or exclusions for certain religious organisations and behaviours from their operation. Hopefully you can all see the flaw in that approach. What the government has done here is to falsely characterise exercising religious freedom as actions which would be unlawful discrimination, but for the existence of these exemptions. Well, that characterisation is simply incorrect, and you can see how quickly acts which would be unlawful become acts which should be unlawful. But as we've seen, part of being religious and exercising religious freedom is recognising that religions have the right to organise their affairs and to regulate their behaviours and the behaviours of believers according to the rules and doctrines of that particular religious faith. As I've discussed, it's central to religions that they have their own rules and that those rules are not identical to the way in which everybody else in society behaves. If that's the case, you no longer have a religion. As Notre adjunct Mark Fowler has observed, and I quote, "The language of exemptions contains some beguiling and at times untested philosophical presumptions. What are termed religious exemptions are not true exemptions at all, but are legitimate expressions of religious freedom rights. We do not say, for instance, that the right of the press to free speech is an exemption from majoritarian imposed control. It is a legitimate standalone right. Similarly, we do not say the citizens' freedom to associate around common interests is an exemption granted by the state from compelled forms of association. Why is it that religious freedom is singled out for such laden terminology? So the very structure of our anti-discrimination laws has laid the foundation for arguments that religions and religious believers have been put above the law somehow, and that they should be put back in their place and not have any exemptions. Now, what these arguments do is firstly ignore that religious freedom is inherent to the human dignity of religious believers, and the fact that religious belief came before the law, let alone the evidence that religion is good for people and that religious freedom is good for society. Having set all of the laws up in this way, it's very difficult to put the genie back in his bottle, and plans to now belatedly introduce a religious discrimination bill, especially a religious discrimination bill which, for reasons I'll come to, despite its good intentions, is deeply flawed. What is worse is the fact that this language of exception or exclusion is replicated in all of our state and territory anti-discrimination laws. And in our state, New South Wales, like the Commonwealth, there is no general protection of religious freedom and from religious discrimination. Worse still are the growing number of Commonwealth and state laws which seek to override religious beliefs and to criminalise the manifestation of religious belief. I'll give you some examples. The obligations imposed by Section 46(1) of the Marriage Act following the redefinition of marriage on authorised civil celebrants to explain the nature of the marriage relationship in every marriage that is celebrated by civil celebrants in Australia is as follows. Marriage, according to law in Australia, is the union of two people, to the exclusion of all others, voluntarily entered into for life. Or words to that effect. Now, most Australian weddings are now celebrated by civil celebrants marrying one man to one woman. The Act could easily have accommodated different wordings, but this wording is contrary to the religious beliefs of some marriage celebrants and contrary to and offensive to the religious sensibilities of many brides and grooms and their guests. Another example is the increasing number of states and territories in Australia which have passed laws mandating the referral of patients seeking an abortion by health professionals with a conscientious objection to that practice. Now, these provisions have a particular impact on observant Catholics, given the teachings of that church that direct abortion is always gravely immoral, and that participation like this results in an automatic excommunication from that church. An example of the operation of such a provision is the 2013 investigation and disciplining of a Victorian Catholic pro-life doctor, Dr. Mark Hobart, for failing to comply with the Victorian law. Dr. Hobart's crime was his failure to refer a patient seeking a late-term sex selection abortion. Another example is the increasing number of states and territories which have criminalised a wide range of activities, including public prayer and the offering of support and information about alternatives, within designated exclusion zones near facilities where terminations of pregnancies are carried out. To date, only Christians motivated by their faith have been prosecuted under these laws. 3 elderly Christians were successfully prosecuted in Tasmania for breaching the zone in 2016. Motivated by their faith, they conducted a peaceful and quiet protest outside a clinic in Hobart in 2016. In fact, I'm reliably informed there were no protests in Tasmania until they passed a law prohibiting protests. A similar result was reached in Victoria in relation to a lone peaceful protester there. In the ACT, 3 Christians were successful eventually in having a fine for praying silently and individually outside an office block where terminations of pregnancy were performed set aside. The court did not find there that prayer could not amount to a prohibited protest. It's very clear that it can, because from the reading speeches from the parliamentarians in all of the states and territories that have passed this law, prayer is a direct attack. There was a direct attack on prayer in these laws. But in this case, they were successful because the court could not find that the prayer, which was silent and which they engaged in separately as they walked around an office block individually, because terminations only occurred in the ACT at that time in an office block. The court found that nobody could tell what they're actually doing, so there was no communication, so there was no protest. Exclusion zone legislation criminalises religiously motivated, non-violent and non-threatening behaviour. And it's no joke, it imposes very serious financial penalties and lengthy jail terms. The final example I wanted to mention is really the litmus test for a state's willingness to protect religious freedom, and that is the increasing number of states and territories in Australia which have passed laws to abrogate the seal of the confessional. This is a step that even the very liberal state of California recently rejected. I've written elsewhere about the breadth of the override of the seal which these acts actually provide for. They vastly exceed the recommendation of the Royal Commission. Leaving aside the fact that confessions are usually given anonymously and without any details of times, dates or names, and the fact that even if very, very rarely a child sex offender may have confessed their sins in the past, it's really inconceivable that they would do so if they knew that their confession was not going to be kept confidential. Legislation of this kind has two significant implications for the religious freedom of lay Catholics and their priests. Any priest who broke the seal would be automatically excommunicated. That means he's no longer a priest and can no longer celebrate or receive the sacraments of the Church. That's a pretty big deal if you're a priest. For the faithful, abrogation of the seal involves a direct intrusion by the state into a confidential communication between a penitent and God. It is a serious breakdown of the proper relationship between the Church and the state, as it effectively requires priests to become agents of the state. It must be noted that no state and no territory has acted to override privileges which would actually produce probative evidence of such crimes, such as requiring lawyers to disclose what they have been told of sex offences, or to override the right to silence, which is effectively what overriding a penitent's confession does. There certainly are circumstances where it is appropriate for a state to limit religious freedom, where religious motivation is used to encourage violence, for example. But that is just not the case in any of the examples we've heard from John or any of the examples I've just given you. In my view, these are each examples where there is insufficient justification based on empirical evidence for the state to force people to act against their religious beliefs or to restrain them from acting in accordance with their beliefs. Our lawmakers should tread much more warily and think much more carefully before require real and persuasive empirical evidence before overriding the inherent dignity of religious believers. Finally, let me say something about the exposure draft of the Commonwealth's Religious Discrimination Bill. It is good that the bill does not use the exemption or exclusion language which I've been complaining about is used in other Australian anti-discrimination law when seeking to protect religious belief and practice. But religious believers can only act in ways which are lawful. This wording is very problematic, as anything that is said to be unlawful under any Commonwealth, state or local government law, now or at any time in the future, would be excluded from protection. It does nothing at all to deal with the problems which I've just been talking about, which arise because of laws. An improvement to the bill would be to make it override laws which prescribe any religious belief or activity, unless they are generally applicable serious offences clause. That's offences as in criminal offences, not giving offence. The bill specifically preserves the state and territory laws which override the conscience of health professionals that I spoke about earlier. The law should protect conscientious objectors, with the possible exception of an emergency when action needs to be taken to prevent the person from dying. The bill has a clear intention to override the section of the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Act, which led to the claim against the Catholic Archbishop of Hobart, Archbishop Julian Porteous, for having the gall to distribute a booklet explaining the Catholic Church's position on marriage to parishioners of Catholic churches in his diocese and to parents attending Catholic schools in Hobart. As drafted, the provision in the bill protects only a statement of belief. As within the Catholic tradition, and I'm sure many other religious traditions, faith and reason are not believed to be in conflict. Many church documents combine statements of belief, in some narrow sense, with statistical, empirical and factual material. It's not clear at all that as drafted, the whole of such a religious publication would attract the relevant protection. It should. Section 10 of the bill has been drafted to enable religious bodies generally to preserve their religious identity by only hiring staff that uphold their ethos. It provides that such a body does not engage in discrimination under the Act by engaging in good faith in conduct that may reasonably be regarded as being in accordance with the doctrines, tenets, beliefs or teachings of the religion in relation to which the religious body is conducted. As currently drafted, the bill does not allow religious institutions to certify their own doctrines and ethos through the publication of a policy, for example. The consequence is that the adjudication of matters of theology and religious practice will fall to secular courts that are not at all qualified to decide them. In practice, working out whether a particular religious body is acting in accordance with those doctrines and so on will require a secular court to call expert evidence and adjudicate on that fact. It would be preferable for the provision to require instead the publication of policies and for the test to be whether or not the relevant organisation complied with the policy. This would remove the courts from the uncomfortable position of arbitrating what was or was not a religious doctrine, tenet, belief or teaching of a particular religion. As explained in the explanatory notes, the bill seems to provide protection to religious bodies that only hire staff from that particular religious tradition. But most religious bodies hire staff on the basis that they're able to work within the ethos of that particular organisation or in the context of the relevant faith, rather than only being members of a particular religious tradition, although some do that. The bill should protect both bodies. Other issues that arise from the language currently used in the bill are that it does not apply to governments, and religious freedom is not enjoyed by religious faith-based charities and other religious bodies who engage in commercial activity, and of course many do. Finally, the bill fails to really adequately deal with the Israel from our issue. The provisions do not apply to governments, and they only apply to large employers, that is, an employer with more than $50 million annual turnover. Even when they do apply, they don't apply if the employee's religious speech would cause unjustifiable financial hardship to the employer, whatever that might be. It seems to me to substantially undermine the utility of the provision. So what can we conclude from this short discussion about what our lawmakers need to do to better protect religious freedom? Well, first they need to recognise the importance of the freedom, which forms part of the inherent dignity of religious believers. Our lawmakers also need a better understanding of the benefits that religion brings to people and to our society. With this understanding, they should be much more wary of overriding religious freedom. I think a religious discrimination bill is a necessary step in starting the process of putting religious discrimination on a leveller playing field. But the exposure draft of the bill, which has been released, needs a lot of work. Thanks very much.